There's a moment that happens to many people, usually in their 20s or 30s, sometimes later. They're driving home from work, or standing in their kitchen, or lying awake at 3 in the morning, and a thought surfaces that stops them cold. I don't recognize my own life. When did I become this person? Where did I go? This is the experience of losing yourself. And if you felt it, I want you to know something important right away. You're not broken, you're not weak, and you're far from alone. Today, we're going to explore one of the most common yet least discussed psychological experiences, the gradual disappearance of the self. Let's start with what we actually mean by losing yourself, because it's not a clinical diagnosis. You won't find it in psychology textbooks under that name. But therapists hear about it constantly. It's the teacher who realizes she chose her career to please her parents. It's the husband who can't remember the last time he did something just because he wanted to. It's the mother who looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the exhausted stranger staring back. Losing yourself is the gradual erosion of your authentic identity, your values, your desires, your boundaries, until you're living a life that feels more like a role you're playing than a life you're actually living. And here's the thing that makes it so insidious. It happens slowly. Not in one dramatic moment, but through 1,000 tiny compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time. So how does it happen? Let's break down the psychology. The first pathway is through what psychologists call enmeshment. This is when your identity becomes so entangled with another person, a partner, a parent, a child, that you lose track of where they end and you begin. You start to prioritize their needs above your own, not occasionally, which is normal in relationships, but chronically, automatically, without even realizing you're doing it. Enmeshment often begins innocently. You love someone, so you want to make them happy. You adjust your preferences to match theirs. You put their goals first. You minimize your own discomfort to avoid conflict. Each individual choice seems small, even loving. But over time, these choices compound. You've forgotten what kind of food you actually like, because you always defer to their preference. You've abandoned hobbies they found boring. You've adjusted your opinions to match theirs, to keep the peace. Your inner world has been slowly colonized by someone else's needs and expectations. The psychological mechanism behind this is often rooted in attachment patterns formed in childhood. If you grew up learning that love was conditional, that you were only valued when you were pleasing others or meeting their needs, then losing yourself in relationships feels natural. It doesn't feel like losing yourself at all. It feels like love. It feels like being good. But there's a difference between healthy compromise and self-abandonment, and many people were never taught where that line is. The second major pathway is through societal conditioning and role conformity. We live in a world with very clear scripts about who we're supposed to be. Be successful, get married, have children, buy a house, climb the ladder, look a certain way, act a certain way. These scripts are so pervasive, so reinforced by every message we receive from culture, family, and media, that many people follow them without ever stopping to ask, is this what I actually want? This is what philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called living in despair without knowing it. You're objectively fine, you've checked all the boxes, but there's a profound disconnection between the life you're living and who you actually are. The problem is, you might not even know who you actually are anymore, because you've been following someone else's blueprint for so long. Women, in particular, often lose themselves through societal expectations around caregiving and selflessness. The cultural narrative tells them that being a good woman means being endlessly nurturing, endlessly available, endlessly accommodating. So they shrink. They silence their own needs. They apologize for taking up space. And over years, decades even, the self that had needs and desires and boundaries gets smaller and smaller until it's barely a whisper. But men experience this too, just differently. Men are told to be providers, to be strong, to suppress emotion, to measure their worth by their productivity and achievement. So they lose themselves in work, in the performance of masculinity, in the relentless pursuit of external markers of success, all while becoming strangers to their own inner lives, their own vulnerability, their own authentic desires. Let's talk about trauma, because trauma is another powerful force in losing yourself. When something overwhelming happens, abuse, loss, betrayal, your psyche has to find a way to survive. Sometimes survival means disconnecting from yourself, from your feelings, from your body, from your memories. Psychologists call this dissociation, and while it's adaptive in the moment, it can become a chronic pattern. People who've experienced trauma often describe feeling like they're watching their life from the outside, going through motions but not really present, not really feeling. They've lost connection to themselves because at some point, being connected to themselves meant being connected to unbearable pain, so they left. And coming back feels terrifying because they don't know if it's safe yet. Then there's the gradual loss of self that happens through what I call the erosion of small choices. You say yes when you mean no. You laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You pretend to agree when you don't. You hide parts of yourself that might be judged. Each instance seems trivial, but these small betrayals of self accumulate. Over time, you've trained yourself to override your own internal signals, your gut feelings, your authentic reactions. You've learned to perform a version of yourself that's acceptable, palatable, safe, but not real. This performance becomes so automatic that you forget you're doing it. The mask becomes the face, and one day you realize you can't remember what was underneath. You've lost touch with your own preferences, your own values, your own voice. When someone asks you what you want, you draw a blank. The question itself feels foreign, maybe even threatening. Let's examine the role of fear in all of this, because fear is often the engine driving self-abandonment. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing others, fear of being too much or not enough. These fears whisper, if people see the real you, they'll leave. If you prioritize your needs, you're selfish. If you set boundaries, you're difficult. Better to stay small, better to stay quiet, better to be what others need you to be. This is what psychologists call conditional living. Your existence is conditional on meeting external standards and expectations. And the tragedy is that even when you successfully meet those conditions, even when people approve of you, it doesn't feel good because they're not approving of you. They're approving of the performance. The real you is still unseen, still unknown, still alone. Now, here's a pattern that surprises many people. Sometimes we lose ourselves not through suppression, but through addiction to external validation. The person who constantly achieves, who's always chasing the next goal, the next accomplishment, the next piece of recognition, they might look like they have a strong sense of self. But if you dig deeper, there's often an emptiness underneath. They don't know who they are without the achievements. Their identity is entirely constructed from external feedback. Remove the accolades, the titles, the recognition, and there's a terrifying void. Social media has amplified this dynamic exponentially. We curate versions of ourselves for public consumption, and over time, the curated version can eclipse the real one. We start to see ourselves through the lens of how others see us, or how we imagine they see us. We perform our lives rather than living them, and in the process, we lose touch with the private, unperformed, unfiltered experience of being ourselves. Let's talk about what it feels like to lose yourself, because the emotional experience is distinct. There's often a pervasive numbness, a sense of going through motions. There's disconnection from your body. You might not notice hunger, fatigue, or physical discomfort until it's extreme. There's difficulty making decisions, especially about things that should be simple, because you've lost access to your internal compass. There's a haunting question that appears in quiet moments. Is this all there is? Many people describe it as feeling like an actor in their own life, following a script they didn't write, or like being a passenger rather than a driver. The life is happening to them, not being created by them. There's often depression, but it's a particular kind of depression, not the dramatic, acute kind. but a low-grade, chronic emptiness, a flatness, an absence of joy, not because something bad happened, but because nothing feels real anymore. And here's what makes it so hard to address. The life you've built while losing yourself might look good from the outside. You might have the relationship, the career, the family, the house. So when you try to explain what's wrong, people look at you with confusion. What do you mean you're not happy? Look at everything you have. This invalidation drives you further underground, further away from yourself. You start to think maybe you're being ungrateful, maybe there is something wrong with you for feeling this way. But there's nothing wrong with you. Your psyche is sending you a signal. It's saying, this life doesn't fit anymore. Maybe it never did. So, what does coming back to yourself look like? How do people find their way home? First, there has to be awareness. You have to recognize that you've lost yourself before you can begin the journey back. This often requires stillness, space, time alone with your thoughts. It requires turning down the volume on external demands long enough to hear your own internal voice again. Second, there's the practice of rediscovering your preferences. This sounds simple, but it's profound. What do you actually like? What food tastes good to you? What music moves you? What activities energize you? You start small, with tiny acts of self-honoring, choosing your own meal, taking a walk alone, reading a book you want to read, not one you think you should read. Third, there's boundary work. Learning to say no. Learning that disappointing others won't kill you, and it won't kill them. Learning that your needs are not less important than everyone else's. This is terrifying for people who've lost themselves through people-pleasing, because boundaries feel like rejection. But boundaries aren't walls, they're definitions. They're how you clarify where you end and others begin. Fourth, there's often therapy or deep personal work to understand the origins of your self-abandonment. What did you learn about worthiness? What did you learn about love? What adaptations did you make to survive your early environment that are no longer serving you? This work isn't about blaming your past, it's about understanding it so you can make different choices now. Fifth, there's the practice of authenticity, which is bringing your internal experience into alignment with your external expression, saying what you actually think, sharing what you actually feel, showing who you actually are. This is vulnerable, because you risk rejection. But here's what many people discover: the relationships that can't survive your authenticity weren't actually nourishing you anyway. They were nourishing the performance. And when you let those relationships go or transform them, space opens up for connections that see and value the real you. Finally, there's grieving. You have to grieve the time you lost, the years you spent being someone else, the opportunities you missed because you were too busy meeting others' expectations. The younger version of yourself who needed protection but didn't get it. This grief is real and it's necessary. You can't move forward without acknowledging what was lost. Here's the truth about losing yourself. It's one of the most common human experiences, but we rarely talk about it openly. We're taught to focus on external achievements, external relationships, external validation. We're not taught to cultivate an internal sense of self that's stable, authentic, and sovereign. So, when we lose ourselves, we think it's a personal failure rather than a predictable outcome of a culture that never taught us to value ourselves in the first place. If you're in the process of losing yourself, or if you've already lost yourself and you're trying to find your way back, I want you to know that the journey home is possible. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's possible. You are not permanently lost. You are not broken beyond repair. The self you're looking for isn't gone, it's just buried. And with patience, with courage, with support, you can excavate it. You can come home to yourself. And when you do, you'll discover that the life you were afraid to claim is far more fulfilling than the life you thought you were supposed to live. You are worth finding. You are worth coming back to. You always were. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.